Thank you, Jennifer. And she and I have talked, just so you know, Jennifer and Rich and Doc and I, we've been talking a lot about various classes that we may want to introduce to the body to equip you. So that's coming. So I'm excited to, Demiso's part of that too. Sorry, Demiso. He's part of that too. So I'm excited for that to come. All right. So does anybody else love a good mystery? As a kid, I remember racing home from the bus stop to watch Scooby-Doo every day. Love Scooby-Doo. And I read the Hardy Boys books because I loved a good mystery. I read these other books called Encyclopedia Brown. I even watched Murder, She Wrote. And while the writers for Murder, She Wrote didn't have me as a 10-year-old boy in mind, they certainly had my mother in mind, which is why I would sit, because back in the day, there was one screen in the house, and you had to watch what your parents were watching, right? And my mom loved to watch Murder, She Wrote. But I enjoyed it because it was solving good mysteries, and I loved a good mystery. And even in my day-to-day job, I've been in IT for almost 30 years now, I have to be a detective in that job. So I did become somewhat of a detective professionally. I have to solve mysteries like, hey, Dave, I can't print. Or Dave, so-and-so didn't get the email that I just sent them. Or I work in a small office, so anything with a light or a plug is my responsibility. So I also have to solve mysteries like why the Coffee Maker 5000 has a light on it and nobody can get their coffee. So anyway, I love a good mystery. And I had to solve some mysteries for myself and investigate some things for myself before I was able to accept Christianity. And today, we're going to look at the most important mystery of all time. What did or didn't happen on that hill outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? This discussion is either of little consequence or it's the most important piece of evidence that we need to know why we're here, what we're supposed to do, and what happens to us in the end. And because there's lots of worldviews that will give us great wisdom, and there's lots of worldviews that will make us feel good. But I'm not a Christian because Christianity makes me feel good. It's actually pretty hard when I think about it. Living like a Christian is really hard. I'm a Christian because it's true. And Christianity is true based on the historical event that we're going to discuss today, and that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Paul even lays this out in 1 Corinthians because he tells them, he says, look, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then your faith is in vain, and we've been lying to you, and all this stuff, you're still going to die because of your sin. So this is a central linchpin to what Christianity teaches and what we believe. And the thing is, if I go around this room right now and I ask you why you're a Christian, most of us are probably going to say, I grew up in the church, my family were Christians, I just kind of followed along with them. Maybe I had some kind of an encounter. Maybe I watched a movie and it scared me to death. That was for you, Jennifer. So we all have these kind of experiences. But guess what? Every other worldview says the same thing. I'm a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a whatever, because I just grew up in that faith, or that's what I know, or I had this experience. So if religions have this kind of experiential component to them, then how do we decide which one is true? Because they can't all be right. No matter what modernity wants to say, they teach different things, they can't all be right. So how do we decide what's true? And that's where the resurrection comes in, because Christianity is based on a historical event that we can study and look at and determine what happened, whether it's true or not. So back to detectives. When detectives come upon a crime scene, what they do is they interview the eyewitnesses to try to get clues on what happened. And when they interview these eyewitnesses, they're paying attention to what they did say. They're paying attention to what they didn't say. They're also paying attention to what they could have said but didn't, or vice versa. So we're going to make the case primarily today based on eyewitness testimony. And we're going to start with the Gospels. Now, the gospel accounts are eyewitness testimony of people who were actually there with Jesus while he was speaking and teaching and the events that happened after he was executed. And we're going to start with this premise that the Gospels are actually reliable eyewitness testimony. We kind of have to start with that. Making the case that the Gospel is reliable is one of my favorite things to talk about. I've been talking about it for 15 different episodes on my podcast now. I actually have a podcast where I go into those things in more depth. So if you're interested in hearing why the Gospels are reliable and you should trust them, then ask me and I'll send you a link to it, and I'm happy to let you hear that. But besides the Gospels, we actually have other sources that give us clues to what happened that day. And these are what a detective or a prosecuting attorney or whatever would call hostile sources. These are sources that don't agree with Christianity. In fact, they were against Christians. But even in reading some of the things that they have to say, we can gather some clues on what happened on that day, in that course of those 3 days there. So the first one I want to look at is a man named Josephus. He was a Jewish historian, and he wrote these volumes called the Antiquities. And in there he writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he a teacher. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us," meaning the Jews, "had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians still named for him are not extinct at this day." So the second source I want to look at is a man named Tacitus. He was an ancient Roman historian and a politician, and he writes, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fashioned the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name has had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of our procurator, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." And then the last one I'm going to mention is a man named Thallus. He was an ancient Roman historian as well. And he writes, "A most terrible darkness fell over all the world. The rocks were torn apart by an earthquake, and many places, both in Judea and the rest of the world, were thrown down." Now, Thallus, later on in this passage, he dismisses this darkness that he experienced as some kind of a solar eclipse. But through science, we can calculate exactly when every single solar eclipse has happened throughout history, and we know that this particular time, there was no solar eclipse at that time. So it wasn't a solar eclipse like he thought. But that's all he had as the only frame of reference that he had at that point. And there's actually 2 or 3 more sources that I could go through that are hostile to Christianity, but we don't have the time for that. But there's definitely more. All right, so as we examine these eyewitness statements, what we can gather several facts about things that happened on that day or on that weekend or those 3 days. And there's a lot of things that real historians, secular or sacred, will actually agree to. There's a lot of facts, but we're going to focus on 3 today. First, the cross contained a dead body. Second, the tomb contained no body. And third, the apostles saw somebody. Easy to remember, right? Like I made it easy. No body, dead body, no body, somebody, right? Like that's easy to remember, those 3 facts. So first, we want to examine this fact that the cross contained a dead body. First off, the Romans knew how to kill people. And the crucifixion process was designed to do that really slowly and in an agonizing way. The first thing that would happen is you would be whipped with this thing called a flagrum. And a flagrum, like this on the screen, it has a handle and it has these strands coming off of it. It was sometimes made of leather, sometimes made of rope. And inside of there would be tiny rocks or pieces of glass or metal or something like that, sharp things. And they would tie you down and expose your back, and they would whip you across the back with this thing and drag it down your skin, ripping your flesh off of your back. It's excruciating, right? So after that was done and you were almost beaten to death, then you would be forced to carry your crossbeam from this site to the site of your execution. Once there, they would nail through your wrist. I mean, oftentimes we talk about nailing through the hands, but the word in Greek that's there is actually, it means this part of your arm. It doesn't mean just the hand, because if you nail through the hand, there's not enough meat there to hold you up. So they nail you through your wrist like this. So they put you on the crossbeam, and then they nail the crossbeam there, and then they put nails through your feet to hold you in place, and they raise you up in the air. And you're in a position like this, and what happens is you become so tired that you sag down like this, so your arms are above your head. And if you do that, it becomes really, really hard to take a breath. So the only course of action you have is to push up on your nailed feet like this to take a breath. And then, of course, you're in excruciating pain and you become tired, and so you let back down. So, and now think about this too. Your back is completely ripped raw, and you're on wood. So you're going up and down on this wood as you're exposed back, as you're trying to catch a breath. So the way that you die of crucifixion is eventually you become exhausted and you die of suffocation because you can't push yourself up anymore to take a breath. And in the case of, in Jesus' case, we have documented in John's gospel that what happened is the centurions, the guards, they shoved a spear in Jesus' side to make sure that he was dead. So because they wanted to make sure that this guy was dead before they took him off the cross. And in his gospel, John records what happened when they poked him in his side. So when they jabbed him in his side, John says blood and water came out. And for a long time, the church kind of, they made a very spiritual thing about this water, and it was the water of life and all that kind of stuff. But if you ask a doctor, they'll tell you what that fluid was, because what happens is when your body is under an extreme amount of stress or shock, when your body goes into shock, you have these sacs around your lungs and your heart, and they fill up with fluid. So when they punctured him in his side and this water comes out, that's evidence of the level of shock that his body was in while he was on the cross. So, and the soldiers did this because they poked him in his side because they knew that if they took a live body off the cross, then they were going to be the next ones executed. So they wanted to make sure that dead was dead. So the next thing, so the historians agree that the cross contained a dead body. And the next thing that the historians agree on is that the tomb contained no body. And we'll start by looking at the burial process. So first, the burial action that we have in the record. Jesus' body was taken by Joseph of Arimathea, who was he was a member of the Sanhedrin Council, and another man named Nicodemus. They take the body, they prepare it with spices, they wrap it in a shroud, and then they put it into a tomb that's owned by Joseph, and then they put the rock in front and close the door. Next, the day after Jesus was buried, the Sanhedrin go to Pilate, and they say, look, this guy has been predicting that he's going to come back to life. We need guards to make sure nothing happens. And Pilate says, go ahead. So they put some guards, they put guards in front of the door. And now a guard is not like a single person. We're talking like 10 guys at least, well-trained soldiers standing there guarding this tomb of this man that had been placed there. Now, so we've established that Jesus was dead and buried in a tomb. So how do we know that, we know that he's laid in a tomb. So how do we know that the tomb was found empty? Well, first off, the reason that we can believe that the tomb was empty is because of who reported it first. And that was women. Because back then, because back then, that society did not trust the accounts of women in these kind of situations. This comes from the Talmud. These are considered unfit witnesses, gamblers with dice, those that lend with interest, pigeon racers, those who trade in the produce of the sabbatical year, and slaves. This is the rule. All testimony that a woman is not fit to give, these are also not fit to give. See, women were only, at that time, and this is a very legalistic society, right? So in that time, women were only permitted to testify to things that they might know about, like certain cultural practices or places that only women were allowed to frequent, or to the purity of themselves or to another woman. That's all they were allowed to testify about. But when it came to witnessing an event occurring in the street, not so much. They would not trust a woman's testimony. And Josephus actually says this in the Antiquities, where he says, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." The culture of the day thought that women were too emotional, too uneducated, and too illogical to be trusted to evaluate what was going on in a certain situation. So, you understand what was the mindset of these people. So for women to be the one recorded in the Testament, in the Gospels, as being the one that found the tomb empty is pretty shocking for that time. Because if I was walking in that society, if I was walking around and they said, "Well, how do you know that it was, how do you know the tomb was empty?" And I would say, "Well, Mary found the tomb empty." And he would say, "Oh, really? A woman? You believe that? Women are..." Anyway, so you wouldn't put that in there if you're trying to convince people that this was true. You wouldn't say that. You would only say that if it were actually true. So that's why we can trust that the tomb was empty. And the second reason that we can trust that the tomb was empty is due to where Christianity started. Where did Christianity start? Jerusalem. Where was Jesus executed? Jerusalem. This is the audience participation part. You guys can feel free to answer. Christianity starts in the place that Jesus was executed. So it would have been really easy for the Jewish High Council to go, with people running around saying Jesus is risen, it would be really easy for them to go to the tomb and say, "He's right there, still dead." But nobody ever did that. That didn't happen. In fact, we know what happened. The guards came to the Jewish High Council and they told them what happened. They said the tomb is empty. And what did the Jewish High Council say? They said, "Just tell them you fell asleep. We'll take care of it. We'll grease some hands. It's fine. Just tell them you fell asleep and didn't see what happened." So that's an admission of what? That the tomb was empty. They wouldn't have made up that story if the tomb wasn't empty. So we know the tomb was empty. And the final thing, the final piece of evidence that we're going to talk about is that Jesus' disciples saw somebody. And in the time following the discovery of the empty tomb, people that were close to Jesus report seeing him and experiencing him up close and personal. And the way that these people's lives changed is really compelling. And when you look at these people's lives, their actions point to them believing the things that they did and the things that they said and how their lives were transformed, point to them believing that it was actually the real Jesus that they saw after his crucifixion. According to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8, Jesus appears to the following people: first to Peter, then the 12, then more than 500 of their brothers and sisters, then to his brother James, Jesus' brother James, then the rest of the apostles, and finally to Paul. So think back. What happened when Jesus got arrested? Okay? What happened to Peter? What did he do? He denied Jesus. He's like, "I don't know that guy. I don't know who he is," But what happens to Peter after he reports seeing Jesus? He goes all over the area spreading Christianity. He's tied to the church, not starting the church, but he was a bishop of Rome. Eventually, he gets executed. That's a changed life right there. What happens to the other apostles? When Jesus was arrested, everyone except for John hid when he was being crucified. They all hid and scurried like rats. And yet, shortly after saying that they've seen the risen Jesus, they go out all over that area. They're all over the Mediterranean area. One of them even ends up Thomas even ends up in what we would call India today. So, so their lives changed pretty dramatically. In the end, most of these guys, like Peter, also were executed for what they were teaching. And also in that account in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions the 500, like, "Hey, if you don't believe me, go check the 500. There's a bunch of other people that have seen him, not just me." And Paul, Paul, of course, converted to Christianity. At first, he was hunting Christians and executing them and arresting them, but he converts. So they saw something that motivated them to change pretty dramatically. All right, so look, those are the facts. We can agree to those three facts, right? The majority of scholars will agree to those three facts. So as detectives, what detectives do is when they investigate a scene or something that happened, they take these little pieces of data, they take the clues, they take the facts, and they try to understand what is the best explanation for these facts. So that's our job as detectives. These are our three facts. What is the best explanation for what happened? And we need to determine the most reasonable conclusion. Not possible, not probable, reasonable. Anything is possible. We want to go with what is the most reasonable conclusion. And now I'm going to kind of zoom through these. We're going to talk about four possibilities, four possible explanations for these facts. And I'm going to zoom through them. Again, I'll be doing extensive episodes of these on my podcast, and where I'll get into much more detail on those. All right, so, and there's actually more than four, so, but we're just going to look at four. So the first one I want to talk about is this theory called the swoon theory. And the swoon theory says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That's how the theory starts. They dispute the first fact that Jesus died on the cross. But if this theory is true, it would explain the second and the third fact, because if Jesus really didn't die on the cross, somehow he made his way out of the tomb, which is why the tomb would be empty, and then he made an appearance in front of the apostles, which is why they saw him. So if this theory is true, it would explain two of those three facts. Excuse me. But this theory has a lot of problems. Problem number one, again, the Romans knew how to kill people, and they knew how to do it really well, and they knew what dead bodies looked like. Problem number two, the Jews knew what dead people looked like. Remember, after Jesus is declared dead, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take his body, and they're intimately touching the body. They're preparing it with spices. They're wrapping it in a shroud. They spend probably an hour or so at least with the body, packing it up. And remember, as soon as someone dies, their body immediately starts going through a change process. Lots of different things start happening as soon as you die and as soon as your heart stops. And in a modern society, we individually probably don't have a lot of experience with death. I mean, maybe we've come across a loved one who has passed away, but in modern society, usually, maybe the coroner is the one who does the autopsy and examines the body, and usually it's the paramedics or whoever who take the body away from the scene of where they passed. And then the mortician is the one who prepares the body for burial, and then the funeral home is the one who puts the body into the casket. And the funeral homes do everything that they can to make this person look natural when they're in their casket. So there's a lot in modern society. There's a lot of different hands involved in the death process. But in the first century, when this happened, the Jews were involved in all of it. It was the family who would have declared the person dead. It was them that would have prepared the body for burial. It was them that would have placed the body into the tomb for burial or wherever they were buried. So they were intimately involved in the death process. They knew what death looked like. They would intimately be touching and feeling and all that kind of stuff. Dead bodies look and feel different. So based on these details, it's safe to say that Joseph and Nicodemus, as they're preparing the body, would have known if the body was alive or not, if Jesus was still alive or not. They would have known that he was dead as they're preparing him. All right, so the third problem is getting out of the tomb. So let's pretend that let's just pretend that Jesus did actually survive his attempted execution. Think of the state that he's in. He's got holes in his feet. He's got holes in his hands, his wrists. He's got this big gash in his side that's pierced most of his major organs on the side. Now he has a 1-ton stone in front of him that he has to somehow get away from the door. I mean, a normal person I don't know, maybe Richie, because he works out all the time, maybe he could move the 1-ton stone, but a normal person's not going to be able to do it. In fact, for someone to be able to do it themselves would probably be a miracle. So based on that detail, he's not going to get out of the tomb. It's not going to happen. Now, the fourth problem with this theory is the guards. Because remember, They put guards in front of the door. So there's people standing there waiting, making sure nothing's going to happen. So Jesus would have had to somehow sneak past the guards or take them all out like some kind of a ninja or something like that. I don't know, but he would have had to get past the guards. And then the final problem is that he was seen by the apostles. And that may not seem like that may seem like not a problem, but think about the condition he shows up in. Bloody, a mess, he's got a huge gash in his side. If somebody walks in the room looking like that, I'm not going to say he is risen. I'm going to shout that he needs a doctor, right? Like, they're not going to think that he just come back from the dead. They're going to think that he survived, so they're going to try to get a doctor for him. So when you look at the problems of this theory, that he had to survive a Roman crucifixion, that he had to appear dead enough to be buried, that the people who saw him thought that he had actually risen from the dead, they had to get past the guards. This theory is highly suspect, and it has a lot more problems than answers. So the next possible explanation is that the people who claim to have seen Jesus just hallucinated him, right? And on the surface, maybe we can relate to this theory because we've all been through moments of grief where we've really desired to see a loved one who has just passed. And maybe we're walking down the street and we see grandma's face on someone as she walks by. Or maybe we're sitting in the house and mom's rocker rocks, or we smell grandpa's cigars or something. So we've had these kind of experiences ourselves, probably in the midst of grief and wanting because we miss our loved ones. So before we dig into this theory, though, let's remember our facts. What are our facts? Dead body. No body. Somebody. Thank you, Richie. So those are our facts. Dead body, no body, somebody. So before we get into the hallucination theory, we want to talk about what a hallucination really is. And a hallucination is a perception of something that isn't there. It's your mind playing tricks on you. So notice, it's your mind. It is a personal experience, okay? And because it takes place in your mind, it can't be a shared experience. There's no documented cases of group hallucinations. And now, groups of people may be tricked into seeing something, like an illusion by a magician or something, but an illusion is the manipulation of things that are in the physical world, like with a mirror or with lights or something like that, to make something appear. But that's not a hallucination, that's an illusion. So after Jesus was put to death, his disciples certainly would have been in some sort of, state of grief, and they would have been sad and upset. But remember what we said about the testament, and then we start talking about the appearances. Let's look at the appearances that are listed in the Gospels. So in Matthew 28:9, the first appearance was to the women. The women touched his feet. They physically touched Jesus. And remember what we said about the testimony of women at that time. If someone told me at that time that a woman touched the feet of this guy who had died, I think you're crazy. Right now, no matter who told me, I might think you're crazy, honestly. But you wouldn't make up that fact and put it in your account if it were a lie, because it would make your account be untrustworthy at that point. You would only put the fact in there that a woman touched his feet if it were actually true. Next, Jesus appeared to Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus. And Doc, if you remember, Doc actually taught this passage about a month ago or so, where he was talking about the journey that these two disciples went on. And I want to just say it at this point because we haven't proven that it was Jesus. So this thing appears to these apostles as they're walking home, or to these disciples as they're walking to Emmaus. He appears to them. Them is the operative word. This thing appears to two people at the same time. And remember, hallucinations are personal experiences. And not only does he appear, he walks with them for a very long time. He's there for, it's like an hour. Doc said it was like an hour walk, probably, to get from there to there. So he's walking with them. He's talking with them. They invite him in. And then what happens? They have a meal together. Okay? They have a meal together. So And Jesus does this as if to literally show that he's a physical being. He breaks bread with them, and then he disappears. I know. After Jesus left these guys, then these two men ran to tell the other apostles what they had just witnessed. And as they're standing there, what happens? Jesus shows up to them, and they all see him at the same time. And what does he do? He sits down and he has a meal with them again. And they all see it. They're all witnessing him do these things. Now Thomas wasn't there. And that's why we call him Doubting Thomas, because we know in the story, he said, I don't believe you guys. Like, that's crazy. So what happens? Jesus shows up again. And he shows him, look at the holes in my wrist, look at the holes in my feet. Now do you believe? And I know that there's these kind of spiritualized images of Thomas kind of putting his fingers in the wounds. We don't know. It's kind of hard when you read the text to know if Thomas actually put his fingers in the wounds. But what we do know is he saw enough physical evidence at that point to change his mind completely. He went from doubting Thomas to falling on and saying, my Lord and my God. So he saw enough there to be convinced. Now, some days later, the disciples are out fishing. And what happens? They see Jesus on the shore. And whatever this thing is that they see on the shore starts a fire and makes them breakfast. So now I can understand, like, if you're out in the water and there's some kind of fog and then maybe there's a rock, a pillar of rock or something there standing. But the pillar of rock wouldn't walk over and make you breakfast, right? Like, it doesn't do that. Only physical things do that. So then we have, so that's the apostles and that's his disciples. But there's a couple other people who report seeing him that are kind of a problem to that story a little bit. And one of them is James, his half-brother, and the other one is Paul. So James, Jesus' half-brother, sure, he could have been sad because it is his brother after all. But James thought Jesus was crazy. He wasn't one of Jesus' followers. He thought he was crazy and a lunatic. But yet he appears, and what happens to James is James becomes the central figure of the Jerusalem church in Acts. He's the top guy there. And think about Paul. Paul was out there persecuting Christians, and then all of a sudden he sees something that convinced him so mightily. And again, so he hears the voice and he hears Jesus' words. And there were other people who were with him who didn't hear the exact words, but they heard this. They heard noise. When Paul was hearing this thing, they heard voices, but they couldn't understand it. So again, multiple people witnessed the same thing on the road to Damascus. And it doesn't make sense that Paul would just make this up, because he was kind of the Jewish golden boy. He was already destined for a good life. So there's one final problem. So let's entertain this idea that all the people maybe actually did hallucinate Jesus being there. Let's remember our facts. Does anybody remember the facts besides Richie?
Dead body. Nobody. Somebody.
Awesome. So do you see a problem with this theory? Where's the body? If they're hallucinating Jesus being alive, then the body should still be in the tomb. But it's not there because he's not there. Okay, so that's a major problem with this theory that needs to be accounted for. So based on this evidence, it isn't reasonable to believe that the events that these disciples experienced and the way that their lives were transformed, again, they went out spreading the gospel all over. It isn't reasonable to think that they witnessed a hallucination and that's what got them going. It's not reasonable. So now we come to what I used to think before I became a Christian was the most attractive theory, and that is that there was some sort of conspiracy going on. And I admit that before I found Christianity to be true, I believed that there was probably some shenanigans going on. And I just thought that the reason, and I'll tell you why, because I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and one of my favorite shows was The X-Files. Still love that show. And if you remember back then, Area 51 and Roswell and all these kind of conspiracy government cover-up things, they were really popular. And so I still have a healthy mistrust of large, powerful organizations, right? I mean, I get it. And here I was looking at the church, seeing all these massive churches and all this money and all this power and all this shenanigans. So before I started studying church history, I thought that the only way that they got like that was because they were up to no good. So sure, they probably did something underhanded to get this whole thing kicked off, was my thought. But we have to ask, what makes a good conspiracy? And in his book, Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace gives a few different things, because J. Warner Wallace was a detective. So he dealt with gang units, and gang units, and he was a homicide detective. So he had a lot of intimate knowledge of conspiracies and how they work. And he outlines in his book, these are the things that make for a good conspiracy. So the first thing that makes for the conspiracy is the amount of people. A good conspiracy has to do with the amount of people involved. When you have a conspiracy, the fewer people involved in the conspiracy, the better, because the more people there are, the greater opportunity there is that somebody's going to spill the beans, right? So the smaller the number, the better. It's just simple math. The next thing that makes for a good conspiracy is the ability to maintain thorough and up-to-date communications. This is why when cops come onto a scene or investigators come onto a scene, they split the witnesses up, because they want to get this person's story and they want to get that person's story. Because if we've done something goofy and we're standing next to each other, we can play off of one another and just kind of make our stories kind of line up at the moment, right? So if you have that ability to have close communications, then that makes for a good conspiracy. Another important element is time. The longer you have to maintain the lie or the conspiracy, the worse off it is. So if it only is going on for a short amount of time, then that's better. And then you also have to consider the closeness of relationship with the conspirators. Because, if this is just some random guy that you're doing a job with that you don't know very well, or maybe he's just a friend that you've known for a couple of years or so, you're less likely to take one for him, like to go to jail for him. But if it's your parent or your brother, your sister, your grandma, whatever, then you're more likely to take one for the team and say, yeah, I did it, or lie for them or cover for them or whatever. And then finally, we have to look at how much pressure the members of the conspiracy are under. Because if there's no pressure on you, then you're not likely to do anything unless your conscience gets the better of you, right? But if you're part of a conspiracy and the investigators start putting pressure on you, then yeah, you're going to get defensive and you're going to have to decide, am I going to cover for this guy or am I going to spill the beans to save my own bacon, right? So the pressure matters as well. Now, people commit crimes for a reason. And J. Warner Wallace will tell you there's only 3 main reasons that people commit crimes. That's greed, passion, or power. And if we think of a lot of crimes that we've all been witness to or heard about, that we know this is true, right? Like we all know about people getting greedy, so they steal something, or they want to trick someone. I mean, I love a good heist movie. That's one of my favorite genres of film is heist movies. So we all know why people do things for money. We know about crimes that get committed for passion, right? Like a lot of murders are because it's in the heat of passion. You found your cheating spouse, or your spouse knocks you off because they want to be with somebody else. So we all know about passion and how that's a major motivating factor. And then the next one, finally, we have power, right? Like again, people take shortcuts because they want to get ahead in life. So they cheat or they steal or whatever to get ahead in life. So power is another motivating factor. So many people will attempt to explain the resurrection events as part of some grand Christian conspiracy. And the theory goes something like this. So you can accept the fact that Jesus died on the cross, and that's fine. And the theory will work. You can also accept the fact that he was buried in a tomb. But in order to make it look like he rose from the dead, the conspiracy theory goes that his followers stole the body out of the tomb. So now let's talk about the empty tomb, though, because in order to fake Jesus' resurrection, this is what the disciples would have had to do. They would have had to steal his body and say, "Hey, look, he's not there." But think back to the Jewish council. What did they do? They put guards there because they had heard Jesus saying that he was going to come back from the dead. And ironically, this isn't actually an uncommon thing for history, because there were plenty of powerful people who said that they were going to rise from the dead and be made into gods. Like that happened with Alexander the Great. Like Alexander the Great conspired with his followers for them to steal his body out of his tomb so that when people would come to see him, he would be gone, and they could say he must have risen to become a god or whatever. So this is not uncommon. But so remember, the council they put guards there to guard the tomb. So they would have had to get past them. And this isn't like a mall cop. No offense to any mall cops if there are any in the building. But it's like a bunch of guards, well-trained soldiers, right? So the apostles would have had to get past them. And again, when they went back to the council, we have the document, we have the report. They said that the tomb was found empty. They would have said that they would have looked like they gotten beaten up or something like that, but they didn't look like that. They said the tomb was empty. That wasn't what they reported to the council. So we also have to address the way that the lives of Jesus' followers changed so dramatically after they report seeing Jesus. Remember, when Jesus was arrested, they all ran and hid because they were scared. So what could they possibly hope to gain by committing this conspiracy? What would their motives have been? I mean, the Jews were already God's people. They already felt themselves superior to everyone else in society. So why would they make this up? But these guys suddenly became brave and courageous and shared the gospel to the risk of their own health. So now we all know what happened on 9/11, and we know what motivated that attack. It is a worldview. So yes, people are willing to die for their worldviews. That could be wrong, but you don't die for something you know is a lie. You don't make something up that you know is a lie and then die for it, which a lot of these guys did. And a conspiracy never would have worked. Like let's look at our factors again about what makes a good conspiracy. First off, there were too many people involved. I mean, there's 12 apostles, well, 11 apostles, and then there's hundreds of disciples. Now, they may not have all been in on a conspiracy, but it's going to get out amongst them that something had happened. So there's way too many people involved. And then also, to keep a strong conspiracy going, you have to maintain strong lines of communication. But think about what happened. Like shortly after Pentecost, they're all over the place. There's some in Egypt, there's some in Turkey, there's some that, again, one of them ends up in India. But if you look at the stories that they tell and their writings, it's all consistent. It's all the same story. There's no changes. But if I'm over here and Richie's over here and Ron's over there, and we have to kind of make up lies and cover for ourselves, then we're going to have different accounts. But the accounts are exactly the same. And think about it. Back then, there's no texting. There's no email, there's no phone so that you can all keep things together, but their stories were consistent the whole time. Now, how about the test of time? Because remember, the shorter the conspiracy, the easier it is to maintain that conspiracy. But the apostles maintained, they said the exact same thing. Their story never changed for 40 years. And John even lived into around 80, 100. He died somewhere between 80, 90, and 100. And he kept saying the exact same thing for 70 years. He said the same thing. His story never changed. That's an awful long time to keep track of details. I mean, we've all told lies in our life. And we know how hard it can be once the lie gets going, how hard it can be to keep that lie going for 73 years. You're going to forget details and things are going to get messed up, but that never happened. And how about the closest of the conspirators? I mean, sure, there were some that were brothers and cousins or whatever, but most of them weren't related to each other in any capacity. And what you have here are actually 3 or 4 different family groups. So remember, if the pressure gets on, then sure, those family groups are going to get tight, and they're going to kind of circle the wagons internally. But there's going to be a lot of fighting back and forth between those groups, and the groups are going to splinter, and you're going to have one side go one way and one side go the other. They're going to turn on each other the more pressure there is. But that didn't happen either. And then what about the figures of James and Paul? Again, James thought Jesus was a lunatic. Why would he join this conspiracy? What did he possibly hope to gain? And Paul, again, Paul is destined for the good life. He is set for life. He's going to be one of the people in the high council. So he's going to be rich and well taken care of his whole life. What could he possibly have hoped to gain in this conspiracy? The only thing that makes these people become part of the story is if it's true. Now, the final test about the conspiracy is the pressure that these apostles would have felt. Think about the kind of pressure that they felt almost immediately. Almost immediately, Jesus' followers were being harassed and pressured, and not by the Roman government right off. It was by the Jews themselves. They were chasing them out of towns, and they were stoning them. They were throwing them out of synagogues. They were arresting them. They were being persecuted immediately. So you had to fear for your life if you wanted to call yourself a follower of Jesus. You weren't getting ahead anywhere. But despite all this pressure, no one cracked. No one changed their story. It was the same for their entire lives. These men died proclaiming the same thing that they taught from the beginning. And now we come to what I feel is the strongest blow against the conspiracy theory, and that is the question of why. What was the point? Why would they come together for this conspiracy? Remember our three things that people do crimes for. Money. Jesus taught them to live almost like beggars. And if you think about it, if money is what they were after, I mean, and I understand why we think that, because we've seen these massive churches full of wealth, but back then that wasn't how it was. If money was the motivating factor, then they should have stayed where they were, because Matthew was a tax collector. He was making money hand over fist because he was skimming off the top. And these other guys were all fishermen. They weren't rich, but they had a steady source of income. So they should have stayed where they were. And again, Paul was destined to be pampered and taken care of no matter where he went. But they gave all that up. So it wasn't money. I mean, even in his letters that Paul wrote to the church, he even discouraged them for paying him for preaching. And he even said, look, if somebody comes around here asking for a handout because they want to preach, don't listen to that guy. So money certainly wasn't a motivating factor for this conspiracy. And what about sexual relations or desire? Well, one of the main messages of the gospel is sexual purity. One spouse, that's it. No side piece, right? Nobody, you can't go to the temple and hook up with the prostitutes there. There was no teaching on how to pick up the ladies, and I promise you. All right, so what about power? Because it's undeniable that a few hundred years, like starting around the 400s or so, the church started to come into power and maintain that power throughout the globe in many countries. And it's been linked with kings and queens and men of power and nations for a long time. And again, this is where my mind went, because I just kind of assumed that the church started like these massive brick structures that we have now, but no. And when I studied history, I found out they were meeting in people's houses. They weren't meeting in these massive buildings and churches. I mean, so when it comes to power, again, the early followers of Jesus did not do it for power, because they had to run and hide. They had to stay out of, they were not getting anywhere. Where they were going to get is on the chopping block or get stoned to death. That's where they were going to get. It was not going to get you anywhere in life in the beginning if you were a Christian. You were going to get hunted and executed. I mean, one of Emperor Nero's favorite pastimes was taking Christians, and he had this chariot racetrack, and he would take the Christians and he would douse them in oil, and he would tie them up on these posts, and at night he would light them on fire to use them like torches as people were racing around the track. That was one of his favorite pastimes. So in the first couple centuries, Christianity wasn't going to get you any place. It was probably going to get you killed. So we have to ask, why did these men and women give up a normal life to start proclaiming this message that was completely counter to what was going on? It wasn't for money or power. They didn't meet in secret to concoct some kind of a way to get ahead in life. It was because they knew the message that they were proclaiming was true. All right, almost done here. So there's one more theory, though, that we haven't talked about, and that is the one, to me, given the evidence, that makes the most sense. And that is that a man from Nazareth was executed on a cross. He died. He was placed in a tomb. He exited that tomb, and his followers saw him in the flesh days later, very alive and very real. And the apostles encountered the risen Jesus just like they said that they did in their eyewitness testimony, and just like he said that they would, and their lives were changed. And he preached to them a message that he is the Messiah and the Savior of mankind. All right, so what I've just done is given what I feel is a pretty strong case for the resurrection. So I think that the most reasonable conclusion based on the facts is that, in fact, Jesus really did die, that he was laid in the tomb, that the tomb was found empty, and his followers saw him risen days later. And this radically changed them. They believed in him, who he said he was, and what he said he was going to do. And in the movie Case for Christ, Lee Strobel he's been on this quest to debunk the resurrection and show that Christianity is based on a lie. And in one of the final scenes here, he's standing there in front of this board of pictures, like an investigator. We've all seen these. There's the pictures on the wall, and there's lines connecting the dots and the evidence. And he's standing there, and he's overwhelmed by the evidence. And he has a decision to make. And because there's a difference between belief that and belief in. Even the demons believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they don't believe in him. So if you've already believed in Jesus, what I hope that I've done is maybe if you've had doubts, I hope I've strengthened your faith a little bit, strengthened what you believe, that you can rest assured that what you believe is based on historical fact and evidence. And I hope that you can take some of this out when you have discussions with some of your non-believing friends. Now, if you still have doubts, though, I have a very modest request. What I hope that I've done, I have a very modest goal here. What I hope that I've done is giving you something to think about and remove some of those roadblocks that you may have in your life and left you with a decision to make. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for basing our beliefs on reality, on facts and evidence. We can know for sure that you sent your Son. We know for sure, Jesus, that you died for us, that you rose from the dead, just like you said you would. Nobody else has done that. No other wise man has done that. No other famous person has done that. You did that as a sign that you are who you said you were. Lord, I just thank you for this message today, and I pray that we can go out today with confidence and trust and know who you are. And then if there are people here in this audience who aren't following you yet, I hope that with this word that they'll come a little closer to you today. Amen.